This month's star for Saturday night at the movies is suave, classic, joyful, elegant, graceful, and he'd be great to dance with. Hey there, Fiber Junkies! Welcome back to The Color Cauldron. I'm Johanna, the owner and dyer behind Potion Yarns and host of this podcast, and it is time for one of my very favorite segments that we do on this podcast, Saturday Night at the Movies. It's the beginning of March, which means that it is time for another movie featuring knitting, wool, crochet, spinning, any kind of fiber arts, even remotely related. And so we're going to do a film review today for you and talk about a fun pattern that I have knit that goes with our film for the evening. So I hope you're ready for some really good fun because we have a great movie to discuss this week. Have you guessed who our star is yet? If you've been following me on social media, or if you just got it from the clues before this episode started, you may have noticed that we have been featuring in our yarn clubs in my online shop. We've been featuring an absolute favorite of mine, Mr. Fred Astaire. Now, maybe you guys have heard of Fred Astaire, but you're not actually familiar with his work, or maybe he's one of your favorites too. But I wanted to give you guys a quick little intro to who Fred Astaire was and why he's one of my favorite stars and what makes his films so magical even today. As we all know, as much as I love, love, love old movies, some of the films from previous eras do not age quite as well and quite as gracefully as other films. So not all films made from the studio era were equal. Some of them are great classics that are just better quality cinema, better classics, or they age better than others. But Fred Astaire's movies were always really, really fun, even if sometimes they get caught up in some of the kitschiness. Today's film, though, is one that I do believe has aged relatively well and is a lot of fun, so we're going to have a good time with that. For those of you who are not familiar with him, though, Mr. Fred Astaire was one of the older stars from Hollywood. He was born in the late 1890s, and he had already had a pretty successful career in vaudeville and on Broadway before he ever came to the movies. He and his sister Adele were child stars. They got started dancing early on in life, and they did dancing and singing and acting and vaudeville routines, and it became kind of a brother-sister sensation back in the day. And so they already had made quite a name for themselves before Fred ever came to Hollywood and started in films. His sister Adele ended up not going on. I'm not sure if she ever made any appearances in film. If she did, it was just a bit part, and I don't know that she ever was in films, but she ended up getting married and settling down to a great life with her husband and family. So she retired early before Fred's star took off in the movies, but he went on to Hollywood and did a solo career after that for many, many years, and actually was in films for over 4 decades, which is quite extensive, especially considering that he already had a career of a couple decades before that. So Fred was really kind of a chameleon in the sense that he could play any role. He even played villains a couple times and was chillingly great at that. But more often than not, he played the lead role or a sidekick to the lead role who was kind of happy-go-lucky, charming, easygoing, popular with the ladies because he could dance, he could dress well, he was a snappy dresser. And actually, a lot of his roles were rather reflective of Fred's off-screen persona as well. In his own life, he was a snappy dresser. He loved fashion and was very concerned with putting himself together elegantly but kind of understated. He was one of the guys where if you watch old movies, a lot of his really old films are black and white, but he did make some later on in his career that were colorized. And in some of his color films, you can see as he's dancing, and his pant leg will come up a little bit, you'll see that he often wore really bright colored socks, which was a device that Edith Head, the costume designer, loved to use for her leading men, but it was also something that Fred himself loved to do. So even when Edith wasn't designing his costumes, that was something that he'd done in his own life for many years. He really liked bright, wild colored socks. Often he'd wear bright pink socks or bright yellow or aqua blue or something with a real sedate gray suit and white shirt, or his signature top hat and tuxedo with tails and a white tie. He was famous for making the song White Tie, Top Hat, White Tie, and Tails very famous, and that was kind of the look that everyone remembered him for. It was probably his most common look that he wore in many, many films. But he was actually even more elegant, I think, a lot of times in his more relaxed, casual styles. He just always had a really kind of old world charm about him in his dress. Fred was a very, very exuberant person who absolutely loved life. He was full of love for learning. He loved learning new skills. He loved practicing and becoming a master at the things that he was passionate about, like his dance. He was an incredible perfectionist, and his professionalism was very, very high. He would never complain at long hours on the set. He never complained about doing more takes. In fact, he was usually the one asking to do yet one more take. Even after 90 or 100 takes of a dance, he would ask to go just one more time because he thought he could do it better. In fact, he actually had a bit of a strict reputation working with his leading ladies when he would dance with women. He made more than one cry, and more than one took off her dancing shoes to find her toes were bleeding and numb and she couldn't feel them anymore. I used to think that sounded so crazy, but for those of you that don't know, I am a dancer in my off-screen life as well. I do swing dancing, and recently, about a year ago, I had a dance performance with a team I used to be on where we were performing for a New Year's Eve kind of party and all-night bash, and so we were dancing on and off for about 4 hours, and it was pretty intense, and there was a lot of, I do the swing dancing with the really big high aerials where they throw you in the air and you're doing flips and tumbling and very athletic style, plus we dance very, very fast Lindy Hop, and by the end of the night, when I took my shoes off, my socks were caked in blood. And so that was the first time that had ever happened to me, and I was like, oh, I feel like I finally made it. I'm finally in the ranks of the pros who have bloody feet after filming all day or dancing all night. So it does actually happen. But Fred wasn't cruel, even though several leading ladies of his did have stories of him making them cry because he would push them to the point of exhaustion and then some. It was never cruel, and no one ever had anything bad to say about him. It was more just, he's an incredible perfectionist and I just wasn't up to the task, and so he kept pushing me until I finally gave everything I had that I didn't even know I was capable of. And you can tell in all of his films, you can tell that he does an amazing job. The ladies he works with do an amazing job, and you can tell that they all have a good time in the long run. Like, there's a lot of blood, sweat, and tears literally behind those dances, but everyone has a real sense of genuine love and joy while they're dancing, and genuine artistry that's just absolute magic. As a dancer, that is a big part of why Fred Astaire is one of my personal favorites. I didn't grow up dancing when I was a little kid. I wanted to, but my parents were not dance savvy or in any circles where we had friends in dance. Everyone in my family played an instrument or just sang, and so I did have some other music lessons growing up and always loved music, but I really wanted to dance. And so it wasn't until I was an adult and went out on my own that I started learning to dance and really just felt like I'd finally found my home. But growing up, I watched a ton of old musicals with my dad, and he loved musical films, and he introduced me to all the greats: Gene Kelly, Fred Astaire, Sid Charisse, all of them. And I just watched hours and hours of films with him growing up and was captivated by all the dancing. And Fred Astaire quickly became one of my favorites. Fred was probably best known for his films with Ginger Rogers. He actually got his start in the late, I believe his first film in just a little bit background part might have been in the very late 1920s, like 1929 or so. It might not have come out till 1930, but he was in a Joan Crawford film where he played himself because he was already a Broadway star, so a lot of people knew his name already. So he just had a little bit scene where he was playing himself and doing dances and like choreographing for a company of dancers in this little film, and it didn't really amount to much, but people loved him and he did so well, and he was a natural in front of the camera that they quickly decided to put him in some other films. So he did a film with Ginger Rogers early on in his career in the early 1930s. He'd already done a few films, but he hadn't starred in anything yet. And he and Ginger were cast as two kind of, not really bit part, a little bit more than a bit part, but they definitely weren't the stars. They were kind of like the sidekicks that helped the action along, and they basically helped the female and male lead fall in love and get together in the story. And it was a film called Flying Down to Rio. And in that film, Fred and Ginger played part of they were in a band, and they played this band leader and this singer, and they did a dance in there to the karaoke, and just captivated audiences, and people could not get enough of them. They made that film. Today, almost no one except the intense movie buffs know the stars of that film, Gene Raymond, and I can't even remember the other one. I think it was Dolores Del Rio. Those names have, for the most part, been forgotten, except, like I said, by the people who study the old films or grew up watching them like I did. They didn't have as long of a career, and they didn't make history the way Fred and Ginger did, but almost everyone has heard of Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers. Even if they've never seen a film and they don't know that much about them, almost everybody knows that they were a dancing team and that they were stars of old Hollywood. And there was something magical about that partnership, and both of these two little actors that were just getting started in their careers and just trying to make it, just captivated audiences, and people demanded more. So the studio was like, oh my gosh, we have gold on our hands, and quickly rushed them into another film called The Gay Divorcee, which was adapted from a Broadway play called The Gay Divorce. And now back then, Gay Divorcee was obviously meaning gay in the old-fashioned sense, where she wasn't a lesbian. It was you know, meant to be like happy and carefree and lighthearted and full of life. And so it's a really fabulous film. If you ever get the chance to see The Gay Divorcee, I highly recommend it. It's very funny, very clever, and a lot of really great dancing and great songs in it. And from then on, that sealed the deal. They were the stars of that picture, and it was built around them. They had lots and lots of dancing time, some singing time, and people just ate it up. And it was solid gold at the box office. So they went on to make a total of 10 films together, including that first one, Flying Down to Rio, over the course of mostly in the 1930s, and then they had one final return film at the end of the 1940s where they got back together for a reunion film that was really, really stunning and wonderful, and is actually one of my favorites of theirs, The Barclays of Broadway. So I highly recommend all 10 of the films. They're all excellent. They all have beautiful costumes, fabulous dancing. Fred sings in all of them, I think, and just really wonderful storylines. But you might notice, if you start watching these films, you'll quickly pick up on the fact that you see a lot of familiar faces besides just Fred and Ginger's. And there was a reason for that. In the old studio system that reigned in Hollywood from the 1920s until about the 1950s, it started to break up, and then in the 60s, finally, there was still a little bit of it in the early 60s, but it was starting to, people were starting to break free of it and do things differently. But before then, prior to the 1960s, the studios reigned supreme. They ruled Hollywood, and there were just a few large studios, and they were in strict competition with each other, but basically actors and actresses were contracted to the studios. And when the studio bought your contract or gave you a contract, they kind of owned you. So they would tell you what time in the morning to get up, when to be on the set, what films you were going to star in. Unless you were a really big star with a lot of clout, you very seldom got to say, yes, I'll take that part, or no, I'm not interested. You just did what they told you to do. They would dress you on and off the screen. In some cases, they would even, as they were grooming new up-and-coming ingenues and young stars, they would often tell you who you were going to date. And you would need to be seen on the town with certain people, and they would fabricate romances about people. They would tell you when you could get married. They would tell you if and when you could have a kid. I mean, obviously not totally. Sometimes people just got pregnant, but there were times that studios would try to be like, you should hold off now. We don't want you to have a kid right now. Or, you know what? You really need something to bring you back to the public's attention and the eye. You're starting to lose your star status. You need to have a baby. It's crazy the amount of control they had over people's lives. The great thing about it, there's been a lot of negative stuff written about the studio system, but there were also a lot of positives. They really did produce an amazing amount of cinema back then, and not just quantity, but also quality. There's some absolutely stunning films that came out of that era. There's some absolutely amazing artists who were groomed, and for many people, their careers were made by the studio system, and a little nobody from Idaho or wherever they're from could become a star because of the amazing ability of the studio system to just take a little nobody, give them a makeover, put them in some pictures, get them into the magazines, and just push them right to the top. It was really incredible. It was very, very hard work though, and it was very demanding, and it was an entire lifestyle. You couldn't act part-time while you do something else, unless you're just doing bit parts. It was a lifestyle, and they took over your whole life, and you had to be dedicated to it. The thing about the studios they were in the business of making money. So yes, they cared about art, but money was top priority. So if something worked, if they stumbled on a formula that made the money, they would keep doing it. So you'll notice in pretty much all the Fred and Ginger films, or most of them at least, you'll see a lot of the same supporting cast working with Fred and Ginger in film after film after film, and often they play very similar roles. Sometimes it changes a little, but there's quite frequently one of the guys that worked with them a lot was named Everett Horton. He is in the film we'll talk about today. He's really funny, playing kind of a dithery, doddery old man, kind of a little bit dumb and just very like I don't know how to describe it exactly, but easily frightened and kind of like doddery and not super bright. And he was just always kind of like a sidekick to Fred Astaire's character. And he shows up in multiple of their films, and he always kind of plays that role. And there was a reason that the studios would do this. They would stumble on a formula, it made money, people liked it, and they would just cast those people in the same roles all the time. And if they found a team that worked really well together and made magic happen on the screen, they would just create a new story, find a new script, or even just invent one, and put that same team into multiple films. So in the 1930s especially, there were a lot of films that were like a series, like the Charlie Chan movies or the Fred and Ginger movies or whatever else. And it was even, sometimes they would be a whole series where the story is related to itself, like the Andy Hardy movies were very popular during this time, and it was always, the same boy and the same family and the same small town, and often the same girls, but not always. And it would be like a recurrent episode of his life continuing on in all these films. But other times, like the Fred and Ginger movies, they wouldn't be related to, the individual stories weren't related to each other at all. They just always had the same cast, the same structure, the same type of story, just the details changed around. However, the thing that made all of their films wonderful and unique, and the reason audiences kept coming back, was Fred and Ginger put unique perspectives into each role, and they always brought the things the audiences loved about their characters to the screen, but they always gave it a new little twist, and all of the dances were wildly different. Fred was incredibly talented at coming up with unique and artistic ideas to really push it to the max. He didn't just get up and dance, although some of his most brilliant dances on film are of him just getting up and dancing in an empty room or on a stage by himself, even without a partner. But he didn't just get up and dance. He was constantly coming up with really unique, crazy ideas, artistic ideas, things that hadn't been done before, to dazzle audiences and to push his art form even further. He was a true artist in every sense of the word. Fred was also always willing to learn from other people. I got the sense, watching his films and reading about his life, I got the sense that he was, like, he knew he was good, but he wasn't full of himself. He never seemed to come across as thinking that he was better than other people. He was just incredibly dedicated and disciplined. But he frequently was inspired by other people, and one of my very favorite stories occurred when Fred was on the set in the late 1930s. There was a troupe of young African-American dancers in New York called Whitey's Lindy Hoppers, and they were some of the people who were basically the parents of Lindy Hop in the early days. They introduced the dance and helped to really shape it in the early years. Lindy Hop Swing is one of the swing dance styles that I do the most, and it's probably my favorite. It's very athletic, it's very fun, it's the opposite of stiff, formal ballroom style. You would never do it in a top hat and white tie and tails. It was very street style swing, very improvisatory, individualized styling was highly regarded, and this troupe of dancers in New York got very, very good. There's whole stories about Whitey's Lindy Hoppers. I highly encourage you to go look them up if you're interested. They're amazing. And Frankie Manning, one of the fathers of modern day Lindy Hop, was in that original troupe and was one of the top dancers there as well. He and a bunch of the other dancers were sent out to Hollywood in the late 1930s, though, to film a couple of dance sequences for some upcoming movies, because Hollywood had found these amazing dancers back in New York who were starting to perform all over the East Coast, and they were taking the world by storm and lighting up the stages with their inventive style, and so they brought it to Hollywood to capitalize on it. And while they were there, the dancers were rehearsing while the cameras weren't rolling one day, and were just practicing and warming up and doing their routine off to the side, and they were amazed to see Fred Astaire walk through the set. And he was just visiting the set, checking out what was going on, and kind of wanted to just watch. And he'd heard about these Lindy Hoppers and was really intrigued to watch their style. So he watched them dancing and watched them working on their dance, and then he came over and introduced himself and started complimenting all of the young dancers. Most of these kids were teenagers and young 20s, still pretty young, very, very wide-eyed. Most of them had never been to the West Coast before, so this was already like way outside their comfort zone. And then many of them had idolized Fred Astaire because he was one of the top dancers in the whole country and just incredibly talented and on every big screen in America and internationally. So to meet their idol in person was already amazing, but then they were stunned when he warmly shook their hand and told them that he was so impressed with their dancing, and he said, "I wish I could dance like you guys." What a compliment, right? Like, here's one of the best dancers in the entire world, and he's way older than you, way more experienced. He's been a star since he was a child, and yet he's totally fine saying, "I can't do what you can do, and it's awesome. I wish I could do that." So they taught him a couple of moves, and he tried dancing with them, and then laughingly admitted that they were much better at it than he was. But he was full of praise for their dance style, and I love that story because I feel like it's a really great way to show that Fred was a star and very professional, but he never let it go to his head. He was always happy to learn from anyone, no matter their age or experience level. Anyone that interested him or intrigued him or was showing talent, he wanted to encourage and learn from. So I hope you can see why I am totally in love with this wonderful star and his legacy that he's left behind, still inspiring dancers today, years and years after his death. So let's talk about the film that we have today. Today we are talking about a Fred and Ginger film called Shall We Dance? This is one of my personal favorites of their 10 films. In fact, if I had to pick just one, I think this one might be it. It's really hard. It's either this one or The Barclays of Broadway. But I really love all of them. This one is one of my very favorites, though. It has a lot of the same people that you'll see in many of their other films as supporting cast, and it also features an absolutely adorable little dog that Ginger Rogers has as a pet, and he comes into play and is part of the plot quite a bit. But basically, the plot centers around Fred Astaire, who is an American dancer named Peter P. Peters, but that's not a very professional name. So as he becomes really, really famous and is getting popular, his manager and patron decides that they should change his name. So now he's been dancing under the name Petrov. So he's posing as a Russian ballet dancer, but he's really an American jazz dancer. He's an incredible ballet dancer and very well trained, but while he professionally does ballet and a lot of really highbrow type of performances, and that's where he's made his fame and fortune, he has a dirty little secret that he really loves tap and jazz and like kind of more street style, American style dancing. So he indulges in that on the side. But he's this famous dancer, and he's over in France, and he sees an American dancer, another American dancer, named Linda Keene, which is Ginger Rogers. And she is becoming quite a sensation in her own right, starring in musical comedies and doing a lot of tap dancing and beautiful routines on the stage. So he decides that he has a crush on her, she's beautiful, and he wants to meet her, and he loves her dancing. So he decides he's going to go and introduce himself and try to ask her out. And he overhears her talking about him, and she's never heard of him before, but she's not very impressed, and she's basically just thinks that he's a simpering toe dancer, as she calls him. And so he decides to teach her a little bit of a lesson because she's being kind of judgy about him without even having met him. So he goes in and like introduces himself with this ridiculous Russian accent and pretends to be this really snobby highbrow dancer, and needless to say, they don't hit it off super well in the beginning. That's also a common theme of many of the Fred and Ginger movies. They often don't hit it off right away. So then, long story short, they end up, both of them decide to come back to America, and they get on board this boat. And Fred has decided that regardless of their little clash in the beginning, he still has a crush on her, and he wants to make a better impression and try to romance her. So this long voyage over the Atlantic Ocean is going to be his chance to get her alone on the boat and try to seduce her. So he sets up all these different ways to meet her, and finally he wears down her defenses, and she starts enjoying his company, and they decide to start hanging out, going to dinner together. Along this time, her little dog is wearing this cute little hand-knitted sweater, and he gets a little tear in his sweater and it needs to be fixed. So they're sitting on board the ship one day, and Fred's reading or something, and she's sitting in the chair next to him knitting on this little dog sweater, but the dog isn't around, so it just looks kind of like a little baby sweater. And in the meantime, word has gotten out to the other passengers on the boat that these two famous dancers are on board. And there's a rumor that has been started that Petrov, Fred Astaire's character, is secretly married and has been for some time, but nobody knows who his wife is. And this rumor was actually started by Fred himself when his character needs to get out of being chased by another dancer who's trying to seduce him, and he's not interested in her. So in order to like kind of brush her off, he lets it slip that he's secretly married and has been for some time, but for professional reasons for his career, he can't be forthcoming with it. And so she spreads this rumor around, and all these people are now trying to figure out who is the person that this famous dancer has married. Well, then people see him on board with Ginger Rogers, and they're sitting there, and she's knitting what looks like a little baby sweater. So then, of course, the rumor starts that they're expecting a baby. And gossip flies, papers pick up on it, and Ginger Rogers is incensed when she hears this because she obviously doesn't want to be saddled to someone and have rumors that she's pregnant when she's not. And in the meantime, she had hatched up a plan. The reason she was coming back from America is because she had a plan to marry a millionaire who was very dull and she wasn't in love with, but he'd been chasing her for a while, and she was thinking about retiring from the stage and just marrying a rich man so she could have whatever she wanted and just leading a life of leisure. So that's why she's coming home from America. And she meets Fred, all of this happens, people start spreading rumors that she's already married, so now she's having a hard time convincing anybody that she's not married, and the millionaire that wants to marry her is suddenly incensed that she's already married and expecting a baby, so she has to convince him that it's just a rumor, and one thing leads to another. And so through a series of crazy events, it goes back and forth with everyone trying to figure out, are they actually married? Are they not married? Are they married? Aren't they married? And the whole time, they're falling in love without realizing it. And there's a bunch of great dancing. There's some absolutely stunning costumes, some beautiful hairdos, some fabulous hats that she wears. And it's just a wild and crazy, silly, hilarious romp. I absolutely love the crazy hijinks of this film, but I especially love that knitting plays such a key point in the plot. So definitely make sure you watch this one and keep an eye out for that cute little scene with the dog sweater that everyone mistakes for a baby sweater. It's pretty funny. That's basically the plot. It's a pretty short film. It's less than 2 hours long. Most of their plots are pretty simple like that, just involving misunderstandings, a comedy of errors, similar to Shakespearean comedies where, you know, people get mistaken for one thing or another, or there's a misunderstanding, and it always makes it pretty fun and really quite silly. So, for this great film from 1937, what pattern shall we work on knitting this time? I thought about doing a baby sweater or a dog sweater since that's what she's working on, but I actually already had finished an item from years ago that I knit that I wanted to share with you because I love how it captures the 1930s style so beautifully. Actually, the sweater that I'm wearing on top is not hand knit. It was something that I purchased in a thrift store actually, and I think it was, well, I'm not sure. It might have been hand knit, but I think it was machine knit. I'm not sure, but this was a purchase sweater. And it's just really cold in my house, so I had to put it on because this is the sweater that I wanted us to knit this time. This is called the Mr. Holland top, and it is a free pattern on Ravelry, so I highly recommend you go check it out. Now, I did see, like I said, I knit mine years ago, probably, oh, it was before I was married, so I'd say probably 9 or 10 years ago. It was a long time ago. So I knit mine quite a while ago, but you can still find the pattern page on Ravelry, which I will link to below. And it still says it's free on Ravelry. However, I saw in the comments section that some people were having trouble downloading it. So if you are having trouble finding a way to download it, go to the comments on the page and scroll to the very bottom, and the designer left a comment with a link to her personal website where you can find the pattern. So if you're having trouble, I would highly recommend going that route. I hope you guys can still get it because this is a really stunning sweater. It's knit in DK weight, and I knit mine in a superwash merino and silk blend from Knit Picks. I don't remember what it was called. It was years and years ago, but I just loved this kind of lavenderish sort of color, and so mine's just a solid Knit Picks yarn. Knit Picks is a really great resource for inexpensive but still decent quality wools and wool blends, especially when you need a sweater quantity like this, so I highly recommend it. But A silk blend is really great as long as it doesn't have too much silk, but you mostly want it to be a superwash merino or another kind of bouncy, stretchy, but soft wool, because this sweater, like many vintage sweaters, is designed with negative ease so that it will really hug your body. So I really liked this pattern because she did a great job of explaining your measurements and helping you take them. And if you're a pro sweater knitter, you probably won't need all of the instructions that the pattern gives you in the beginning. There's this really lengthy explanation of how to take your measurements, ease, and how to work with it, and then a section where she has you go through and figure out your preferred measurements for your bust, your waist, and not just bust, waist, and hips, but also like sleeve length and collar length and all of these different things. It's really worthwhile, but if you're a pro already, you may be able to skip that and just work on the pattern as it is. If you're not a pro, or even if you are, but you're just curious to see how she does it, I highly recommend you go through her little formula. There is a little bit of math involved, but she makes it really easy and she breaks it down step by step. So it's very, very simple, and it really helps you see how the design comes together and how you can personalize it to your individual measurements and preferred style. So like if you don't like as much negative ease, you can make adjustments in that first section where you're figuring out your actual measurements and then your preferred sweater measurements and etc. But I liked it with the ease that she recommended in the pattern, so I made mine that way because I wanted it to really cling. So if you can see, there's a little picot hem at the very bottom, and there's a little picot hem on the collar, which is really cute. And this collar is so cute because it's a split collar in the front where I have my little brooch. It's kind of like a little U shape, and then you have like the collar going up one side and up the other side, and then it just kind of lays over in this really sweet vintage style that is very 1930s. When I first saw this top years ago, I fell in love because it just looked like something that my favorite stars from the 1930s would be wearing in their black and white films. And so I just love it. It's very well written, and it's a really cute, comfy little sweater. I love it so much that I am seriously thinking about knitting a second sweater from this pattern. I don't know what color I want to do yet because I love this color, but I think I want to do something a little bit different. I just haven't figured out what yet, but I really love it. And I am thinking, I did knit this years ago when I wasn't as confident with sweater knitting. It was not my first sweater, but it was fairly early on and when I was just starting to get into knitting sweaters, and it was one of the first patterns I did with negative ease, so that was really helpful. But I think that I didn't do the best job on making my sleeves deep enough. Like, it works, but I have to always like really pull it over and adjust it. And I think I would want to make my sleeve depth just a little bit longer next time so that I'm not constantly feeling like I have to tug at the collar. That's the only thing that I have against it, and honestly I've been wearing it all day today and have been just fine. So I really love it. And you can see in the back it mirrors, it looks pretty much the same in the back as from the front, where it's got that cute little dip in the back as well. The other thing I absolutely love about this top, and the reason I chose it for this month's Saturday night at the movies, is it looks so vintage. If you put this with a little pencil skirt and some seamed stockings and a cute little hat, you are going to look like you stepped straight out of the 1930s, which I know a lot of you guys really enjoy, and I really enjoy that too. But I know that probably a majority of you guys are like, yeah, I don't really need to look like I'm straight out of the 30s, / I don't really want to look like I'm straight out of the 30s. I just want that kind of pretty feminine vintage vibe, but like I want to bring it up to date. This sweater is one of my very favorites for doing that. I don't know if you can see my outfit too well today, but I am wearing, these are technically vintage pants, but they are from the 1970s, and they were handmade, and they're just like polyester, super comfy, high-waisted with kind of wide trouser legs. But they mimic, the 1970s had a lot of crossover with the 1930s and 40s. They brought back a lot of 30s and 40s silhouettes and styles and kind of reinvented them into a 70s version of the 30s and 40s. So I love these pants because they're machine washable and easy care and no wrinkle and all the great things of the like modern technology they had in the 1970s, but the legs are cut really wide leg trouser style but with a high waist, just like the trousers in the 1930s that were just starting to get popular for women to wear. Prior to the 1930s, women really weren't wearing pants or trousers, and if they did, they only wore them like when they were riding bikes with bloomers that came out in the late 1800s, or like at home working in the garden or something, and even then most women would wear a dress dress or a skirt. So it wasn't really until the 1930s that wearing pants or menswear inspired styles became socially acceptable for women. But when it did, women loved the big high-waisted, wide-leg trousers that just showed off their feminine curves and were just easy and comfortable to wear and still looked really cute and put together, but just a little bit more comfy than some of the dresses for certain activities. So that's what I'm pairing it with today, and it looks absolutely stunning. I've also worn it with very modern skinny jeans and boots, and it looks really cute. I've worn it over a little sundress that was like kind of sleeveless, and I just put this on the top and then have like kind of a full skirt. I've worn it with big poofy 50s crinoline skirts, and it looks great. I really can't say enough great about this top. It looks good with everything. It looks awesome when you put a little brooch in the middle, but I frequently wear it without that too. Sometimes I'll wear it with a little vintage slip that has lace here, so it shows a little bit of lace, and kind of pull it down a little more so you can see a little more of the vintage slip underneath. That's a really cute way to wear it. And the other thing I absolutely love about this pattern, I don't have a very large bust size, so I know sometimes the patterns that I choose particularly favor really short people with not very large busts because that's how I am, so I pick things that look good on me. But I absolutely love recommending this pattern to people because not only is it very well written, but it's written in a huge variety of sizes, all the way from like I think like a 28-inch bust or something teeny tiny, all the way up to like triple XL. I don't remember the actual measurements, but I know that it has a wider range of sizes than I am used to seeing, especially for curvy, vintage, fitted styles. A lot of times for the really vintagey looks, they only make it in a few sizes, and if you're not lucky enough to fall in that range of kind of small busted women, you're just out of luck. And the other wonderful thing is because of the way she's written this pattern, and she has it written for so many sizes, I think it goes up to like a 50 or 52-inch bust, something like that. It's a wide range of sizes. So she already has the wide range of sizes, and then if you go through that worksheet in the beginning of the pattern that she gives you that helps you go through all the math and figure out exactly how you want to customize your sweater, you really can make it to fit your body and look good no matter what size and shape you are. So it's a wonderful, wonderful pattern for a wide range of sizes. Again, that link is below. I highly recommend you go check it out. Okay, that's about all I have for you today. I just wanted to share my love for this fun film and this amazing star. You can still order the Fred Astaire yarn clubs. The mystery yarn color is in the shop until March 15th, which is coming up in just a few days, so you need to hurry, but you can still get it. After the 15th, it will not be available anymore, and it is an exclusive colorway limited edition just for the yarn club. Yarn clubs stay exclusive for up to 1 year, sometimes longer, and some never come back. So I honestly don't know yet whether or not this one is going to come back in the future, but it might not. So I'm leaning towards it not coming back. So if you want to get it, I would suggest that you go ahead and grab it now because you may never see it again. And it's a really great colorway. It mixes a very classic, understated elegance with little pops of fun and joy and whimsy in hint, it has speckles. It's not all speckled, but it has speckles. That's the fun and joy and whimsy. And I just picked colors that I saw Fred wear a lot or that made me think of Fred Astaire and his graceful, whimsical, understated masculine elegance. He was a bit more flamboyant than some of the other men of his era as far as like he frequently wore pink and he frequently wore, you know, bright aqua and yellow and stuff, as well as wearing very sedate, just black and white or gray or brown or whatever. He was really great at mixing little pops of color, like a flash of aqua. He liked to wear askets a lot, bright colored socks like we talked about, fun bright colored ties, and so he would add pops of really vivacious color to a really sedate brown and white or gray and white suit. And I just love that. He was such a master at mixing the fun and whimsical and kind of spicy with the really classic, elegant, understated, yeah, just he had a great sense of style. So I tried to capture that in the yarn clubs. I'm not going to show you a sneak peek, but you can see a sneak peek if you're one of those people that doesn't like to order yarn without knowing what you're getting and you don't like the surprise. If you go to my website and there is a link to the yarn club below, click on the yarn club website link and it'll take you to my site. If you go to the product description, so over in the sidebar where there's all the words explaining it, scroll down to the bold paragraph and it'll say right there, sneak peek. and you can click on the sneak peek and it'll take you to photos, full color photos of this month's colorway so you can see what you're getting. If you like the surprise though, don't click on the sneak peek link because it'll ruin it. So if you don't click on the link, you just get to see the Fred Astaire pictures that I have, and you get to order your base yarn in quantity, and then when it comes to you in the mailbox, it'll be a fun surprise and you get to open it kind of like a Christmas gift. Yarn clubs are like Christmas and birthdays all year long. I love them. So I hope you guys have a great time watching that movie. Have a wonderful time knitting your Miss de Havilland sweater. Please, please, please tag me in photos if you knit this sweater. I really, really want to see everybody's progress because this is a really fun pattern and I think it would look great on a lot of you guys, so I can't wait to see if you make it. I hope you guys have a great rest of your day. It is now time to cast off. Love you!